At last we find what we have been searching for 6 months along the Persian Gulf. An open market in human beings. This one takes place in the courtyard of an old fort. 3 men and 3 women are on sale, all Africans. They appear resigned to their fate. Slaves come from black Africa. They can also be procured on the Arabian Peninsula. Sometimes all you have to do is organize a party, the kind the British have called slaving parties. We hear about such a party in Qatar. There's music, dancing, laughter, the kind of entertainment that doesn't take place every day in the desert. The girls come out of the shelter of their homes. They arrive from nearby villages. The canny organizers of the party have accomplished their purpose. They can study the girls at their leisure, decide which ones they will try to buy from their fathers or their husbands, which ones they will have to kidnap. Slavery, we are told, has been abolished. In point of fact, it still survives. In a small villa on the outskirts of an African city on the Red Sea, he gathers the children of his prostitutes in what is officially called an orphanage. Actually, it is a training school for slaves. For the first few months, the mothers can visit their children. Then, the Greek takes over, rearing the children and training them until they are old enough to be of commercial interest to the traders of the Middle East. Prices vary according to age, color of skin, and the work the child is intended for. An attractive half-caste girl of 12 may be worth as much as $5,000. We have been told that a mysterious but important personage is due to visit the Greek today. We wait, and he finally arrives, unaware of the telescopic lenses that are following his every move. He is a buyer come to examine the Greek's merchandise and to purchase the best of it. eventually land either in a harem or in a brothel. If they look happy at the prospect before them, it is because their training under the Greek has led them to expect a life of wealth and ease and love. Several days later, we board a plane bound for Jeddah, a landing point for travelers to Mecca. We ask an officer on the plane the same question we had asked the captain of the ship. He simply hands us the passenger list. 20 persons on the flight are traveling together. Men, women, and children. 12 have round-trip tickets, and the other 8 one-way tickets. These 8 are in effect living traveler's checks that will be cashed in to pay the expenses of the return for the rest of the party.
They are women, servants, and children whom the 4 Arabs will sell as slaves. Their destiny as human traveler's checks has been decided years ago, and now they are carrying out that destiny.
Kuwait, with a population of scarcely 300,000, takes in close to $3 million a day in oil royalties. Not that these millions are allowed to trickle down, but to raise the standard of living of the people, of the Fellahin or the Bedouins. Instead, oil has brought in its wake a new biblical curse. It has raised the price of human flesh. Storage tanks and pipelines add a new and modern decorative touch to the vast emptiness of the desert. But they provide no sustenance for the people who live nearby, in hunger and misery and desperation. Water is precious, and the camel is precious. And to give the camel a rest now and then, water is drawn by slaves. These girls, 10 to 12 years old, are blindfolded to keep from getting dizzy as they take turns with a camel. The most modern equipment available is used to extract oil from thousands of feet below the surface of the earth. But water must be drawn by the effort of human slaves. For luckier children, there are model schools inside the palaces. The pupils pray before lessons begin. We are permitted to film the pupils as they come out of the royal school. More than 100, we are told, are children of the sovereign himself. Following them are the children of the princes and high dignitaries. They're clean, well-disciplined, happy children. But note that some of them do not carry books. These are children of the oil rich. Their books are carried by their personal slaves. Slaves received as gifts from their parents on their birthdays. Slaves who will grow up alongside their masters and serve as their personal gods. Most of these are children of palace slaves, and according to the law, they too are slaves. The oil millions turn into automobiles from Detroit, parking lots, and traffic cops who direct traffic straight toward the desert. We travel along the edge of the Sahara to reach the Peuls, a pastoral people once numerous and powerful, now reduced to a few thousand by mass raids of slave merchants early in this century. They no longer have any cattle of their own. The great herds they lead to pasture are owned by Arab merchants, and the Peuls are so impoverished that they willingly offer themselves in slavery to the owners of these herds. But since they cannot all be taken, the young shepherds show their masters which are the strongest and most courageous among them by submitting to flagellation. The herd owners gaze impassively on the scene, enjoying vicariously the sadistic action before them, and knowing that the strongest will survive. And the survivors smile and smile and pretend to ignore the pain. They fall on their knees and beg their Arab masters to accept their services. West to east, across the heart of Africa to Arabia. This is the great highway of slavery. Across these desert trails, we took our cameras for thousands of miles in search of secret caravans. The governments of the young African republics are doing everything in their power to wipe out the slave trade. Every day, military units on camels check the border zones. They pursue the caravans and examine the documents of the desert buses. Any of these may be engaged in the slave trade. On the border of Chad and the Sudan lies Fada, the base from which the camel patrols set out. Helicopters keep watch along the border. And we have been permitted to accompany the police on one such inspection. Yesterday, pilots spotted several caravans heading toward the wells of Kairouan, the only wells within a radius of 200 miles. All caravans leaving Chad to enter the Sudan must stop there to take on water after checking in at Fada. One caravan that suspiciously avoided Fada has moved into the throat of Kairouan, a bottleneck deep in the mountains of Enedi. Water surging from the springs here cannot evaporate because the high mountain walls keep out the sun's rays. We reach our objective. There is no escape from the throat of Kairouan. It is a dead end. At first, this caravan looks like any other moving from place to place. Camels line up for a drink. Bedouins sit motionless, impassive. The police approach with their interpreter and get permission to search the merchandise. The interpreter notices an odd-shaped bundle with a canvas cover. Where were they taking these children? What market were they headed for? The slave dealers won't talk. The children don't know. So the police are unable to find out, and they lose a possible chance of closing off one more market in human beings. A government official gives us an interview on the subject of slavery. I can assure you, he says, that slavery does not exist in my country. The first official act of my government when it came into power was to draw up stringent laws against slavery. But our country is large, very large. Look at the extent of our borders. Our army and our police do everything in their power to patrol them. But it does happen that the law is violated on occasion. Can you tell me of a single country in the world in which the law is never violated? But here the law may be violated too often.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Mit Gebeten hat man sie gelockt. Die Araber bringen bereits im 7. Jahrhundert den Islam nach Afrika und mit ihm die Sklaverei. Denn wer kein Moslem werden will, wird als Sklave in die muslimische Welt verschleppt. 17 Millionen Schwarzafrikaner trifft dieses Schicksal. Die Geschichte dieses Menschenhandels ist in Afrika bis heute ein Tabu. Tidiane Ndiaye bricht das Schweigen. Der senegalesische Anthropologe fordert, die Sklaverei der Moslems endlich aufzuarbeiten. In seinem Buch »Der verschleierte Völkermord« beschreibt Ndiaye dieses wenig erforschte Kapitel der Geschichte.
Der muslimische Sklavenhandel war der längste in der Geschichte der Menschheit. Er währte 13 Jahrhunderte und hatte viel mehr Opfer als der Sklavenhandel nach Amerika, der 400 Jahre dauerte. Und das Traurigste daran ist, dass die meisten der Verschleppten unglücklicherweise keine Kinder bekommen konnten, weil sie kastriert wurden.
In die arabische Welt, in die Türkei, nach Persien und nach Indien werden die Schwarzafrikaner verschifft. Oder sie werden durch die Sahara nach Nordafrika getrieben. Viele sterben schon bei den Überfällen auf die Dörfer, viele an den Strapazen des Transports. Wer auf den Sklavenmärkten ankommt, wird kastriert. Laut Ndiaye überlebt nur einer von 5 diese gefährliche Operation. Die grausame Prozedur trifft alle, die Männer, die auf Plantagen oder im Bergbau schuften, ebenso wie die, die im Haushalt arbeiten oder die Harems bewachen. Diese Eunuchen findet man noch Anfang des 20. Jahrhunderts.
Die Araber und die Nordafrikaner waren Rassisten. Sie verachteten die Schwarzen. Deshalb wollten sie nicht, dass sie in ihren Ländern Kinder zeugten. Das erklärt, warum es dort heute keine starke schwarze Diaspora gibt wie in den USA, die eine Aufarbeitung dieser Geschichte fordert und eine Wiedergutmachung.
An die Sklaverei der Europäer wird auf der senegalesischen Insel Gorée erinnert. Hier wurden Tausende eingepfercht und nach Amerika verschifft. Solche Erinnerungsorte forderten Ndiaye auch für den brutalen Menschenhandel der Moslems. Der ist für ihn ein Völkermord, denn ein Volk von Kastrierten kann keine Nachkommen zeugen und stirbt zwangsläufig aus. Die Versklavung geschah übrigens im Namen Allahs.
Der Koran hat die Sklaverei niemals unterbunden. Im Gegenteil, es gibt viele Stellen im Koran, die die Versklavung von Nichtmuslimen empfehlen. Und im Gegensatz zur Ächtung der Sklaverei im Europa der Aufklärung gab es nie auch nur einen arabischen Intellektuellen, der sich je für die Sache der Schwarzen eingesetzt hat.
Im Sudan rufen die Araber schon im 7. Jahrhundert den Dschihad, den heiligen Krieg gegen die Schwarzen aus. Noch heute werden hier Tausende von ihren eigenen Landsleuten versklavt. Viele Afrikaner beten in Moscheen, obwohl ihre Vorfahren im Namen des Islam geknechtet wurden. Über Jahrhunderte wurden afrikanische Könige gezwungen, sich dem Islam zu unterwerfen und noch dazu Sklaven als Schutzgeld auszuliefern.
Durch die Islamisierung wurden die afrikanischen Könige zu Mittätern. Wer sich dem Islam unterwarf, konnte der Versklavung theoretisch entgehen. Wer kein Moslem werden wollte, sollte gezielt gejagt werden. Das war der Grund für die Kollaboration und das entfachte viele Kriege zwischen den afrikanischen Völkern.
Die Europäer schauen bis ins frühe 20. Jahrhundert zu. Obwohl sie den Menschenhandel längst verboten haben, dulden ihn die Kolonialarmeen vor Ort. Ein Zentrum des schmutzigen Geschäfts ist die ostafrikanische Insel Sansibar. Hier landen die Menschen nach dem Verbot der Sklaverei in unterirdischen Verliesen. Den berüchtigten Tipu-Tip macht der Menschenhandel zum zweitreichsten Mann Sansibars. Noch nach 1920 schuften Sklaven auf den Plantagen der Insel. 13 Jahrhunderte Sklaverei aufarbeiten, dafür gibt es offenbar weder in Afrika noch in der islamischen Welt Bereitschaft.
Es gibt eine Solidarität zwischen den Afrikanern und den Arabern wegen der gemeinsamen Religion, dem Islam. Man zieht es vor, über diese schmerzhafte Geschichte nicht zu sprechen. Man richtet die Aufmerksamkeit lieber auf die Schuldigen, die alle schon kennen, die Europäer und die Amerikaner.
Tidiane Ndiaye will das nicht hinnehmen. Weder als Intellektueller noch als Enkel eines senegalesischen Königs. Und auch nicht als Moslem.
Christian boys kidnapped from the villages are confined to an Islamic school where they are made to study the Arabic language and memorize the entire Quran. Rising for prayers before dawn and studying until the late hours of the night, they are indoctrinated into the strict teachings of the Islamic faith. Those who refuse to cooperate are beaten and chained until they improve their studies.
They must give up playing. Playing is harmful. It doesn't allow them time to study. Anyone who misbehaves, he's whipped so that he doesn't play anymore. When his colleagues see him being whipped, he will stop playing and become afraid. The Quran is difficult. If they do not work hard, they will not be able to memorize it all.
A lot of the footage that we have received from these nations, some in Sudan, show young boys being beaten, show them chained, walking down these dusty paths around the school compound with chains. In one school, they have to write on a small board that they carry with them Quranic verses and then wash this board and drink the water. And their teachers tell them that drinking this water causes them or helps them to memorize this faster.
Young girls have also been kidnapped and sold as concubines or given over to the sexual pleasures of the Islamic soldiers. Girls as young as 9 have been repeatedly violated. Tens of thousands of children have disappeared, hidden away by radical Muslims seeking to create a new generation void of any Christian faith. Christian men who refuse to submit to the Islamic movement have been imprisoned, beaten, and oftentimes mutilated. Others have been hung, nailed to trees, or drowned in the River Nile.
I must admit that I too, among hundreds of millions of educated people, was under the impression that the African slave trade was the sole responsibility of the Christian Europeans, the white race. That is, until I started exploring the subject in greater depth, and especially after reading an incredibly enlightening book called The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa by John Alambila Azuma. My whole perspective and understanding has changed dramatically, and I would like you to tell us more about this subject.
The success of Muhammadan Islam in deceiving, misinforming, deforming, and contorting both history and reality over a period of almost 1400 years has been astounding. That is, until now. The greatest tragedy about this particular subject is that most of the descendants of African slavery, the black people in the Americas, around the world, as well as among the African blacks, are totally ignorant of the actual facts. Before we lose the concentration of our listeners, I would like to make the following statement and then prove it. That the worst, most inhumane and most diabolical institution of the black African slave trade was initiated, refined, perpetrated and implemented by the Mohammedan Arabs and later aided and abetted by the black converts to Mohammedan Islam. I predict that, as usual, the two subcultures, those of denial of facts and of political correctness, will attack us without once disproving a single statement and or conclusion that we make. Slavery was not created by the white races, because it has existed throughout human history and practiced by every tribe, culture, civilization, racial group and religion. In fact, the very word slavery has its root in the name Slav, based upon the Slavic peoples of Europe who were subjugated by other Europeans. It is not common knowledge that the Arabic word abd is synonymous with the meaning of slave. For example, Abdullah means literally the slave of Allah, and that in the language of the Arabs, all black peoples are called abid, plural, for slaves. While much has been written concerning the transatlantic slave trade, surprisingly little attention has been paid to the Islamic slave trade across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. While the European involvement in the African transatlantic slave trade to the Americas lasted for just over 3 centuries, the Arab involvement in the African slave trade has lasted 14 centuries, and in some parts of the Mohammedan world is still continuing to this day. The birth of Mohammedan Islam and its conquests brought about the birth of institutionalized, systematized, and religiously sanctioned slave trade on a massive and global scale. In fact, the Quran allows the taking of slaves as booty or reward for wars of aggression against any and all unbelievers, most of the human population. This has led to an enormous number of so-called holy wars, jihad in Arabic. There was and is absolutely nothing holy about these wars, which are primarily to plunder, slaughter, rape, subjugate and rob other human beings of their wealth, produce, freedom and dignity. Mohammedan Muslim states and tribes attacked other non-Muslim groups to achieve these objectives. Although Islamic jurisprudence laid down regulations for the treatment of slaves, however, incredible and heinous abuses have occurred throughout the history of Mohammedan Islam. By the Middle Ages, the Arabic word abd was in general used to denote a black slave, while the word mamluk referred to a white slave. Ibn Khaldun, 1332 to 1406, the preeminent Islamic medieval historian and social thinker, wrote, "The Negro nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, because they have attributes that are quite similar to dumb animals." It should also be noted that black slaves were castrated based on the assumption that the blacks had an ungovernable sexual appetite. When the Fatimid Caliphate came to power in Egypt, they slaughtered all the tens of thousands of black military slaves and raised an entirely new slave army. Some of these slaves were conscripted into the army at age 10. From Persia to Egypt to Morocco, slave armies from 30,000 to up to 250,000 became commonplace. The Islamic slave trade took place across the Sahara Desert, from the coast of the Red Sea, and from East Africa across the Indian Ocean. The Trans-Sahara trade was conducted along 6 major slave routes. just in the 19th century, for which we have more accurate records. 1.2 million slaves were brought across the Sahara into the Middle East, as well as a further 450,000 down the Red Sea and 442,000 from the East African coastal ports. That is a total of 2 million black slaves just in the 1800s. At least 8 million more were calculated to have died before reaching the Muslim slave markets. A comparison of the Islamic slave trade to the American slave trade reveals some extremely interesting contrasts. While 2 out of every 3 slaves shipped across the Atlantic were men, the proportions were reversed in the Islamic slave trade. 2 women for every man were enslaved by the Muslims. While the mortality rate of slaves being transported across the Atlantic was as high as 10%, the percentage of slaves dying in transit in the Trans-Sahara and East African slave market was a staggering 80 to 90%. While almost all the slaves shipped across the Atlantic were for agricultural work, most of the slaves destined for the Muslim Middle East were for sexual exploitation as concubines, in harems, and for military service. While many children were born to the slaves in the Americas, the millions of their descendants are citizens in Brazil and the United States of today. Very few descendants of the slaves that ended up in the Middle East survived. While most slaves who went to the Americas could marry and have families, most of the male slaves destined for the Middle East were castrated, and most of the children born to the women were killed at birth. It is estimated that possibly as many as 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic, 95% of which went to South and Central America, mainly to Portuguese, Spanish, and French possessions. Only 5% of the slaves ended up in what we call the United States today. However, a minimum of 28 million Africans were enslaved in the Muslim Middle East. Since at least 80% of those captured by Muslim slave traders were calculated to have died before reaching the slave markets, it is believed that the death toll from 1400 years of Arab and Muslim slave raids into Africa could have been as high as 112 millions. When added to the number of those sold in the slave markets, the total number of African victims of the trans-Saharan and East African slave trade could be significantly higher than 140 million people. What is obscene about this whole subject is the Muhammadan, Muslim, and Arab culture of denial regarding their complicity in the African slave trade, as well as the ignorance of black Muslims about the reality of their past and present conditions. The statistics and reports above are based upon the logbooks kept at the African slave ports, ship logs, travelers' reports, eyewitness accounts, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, the facts and reality of Muhammadan Islam's complicity in the slave trade and their inhuman depravity are infinitely more devastating, more staggering, and more incomprehensible than all the nightmare fictions in the world.
In Chad, a young woman is sold into marriage by her father for 100 salted loaves. The United Nations Convention on Slavery lists such a sale without the woman's consent as an act of slavery. In the Volta Republic, 4 women may be worth a horse with harness. But they must be young, beautiful, and well-dressed. This little girl is worth exactly 70 empty bottles. Even if she could read the United Nations Convention, it would hardly be of any help to her. Nor would its provisions against mutilating, branding, or otherwise marking a slave help this woman, dressed in rags, who totters along with her ankles in chains among the crowds in a large city. This is Porto Novo, capital of Dahomey. We are going to a fishing village on the lagoon of Cotonou in Dahomey. This lagoon has a lovely fairy tale look, and its inhabitants contribute to the fairy tale quality as they gracefully toss their fishing nets onto the waters. But there is nothing of the fairy tale about the harsh struggle for existence of the people of this village, who live exclusively on the fish they are able to catch in the waters that surround their stilt-propped homes. The village is famous in this region for the beauty of its girls, but the lagoon provides only a meager living at best, and many of the male children urge their parents to get rid of the females, the least useful members of the community for work and fishing. Whenever one of the girls disappears, they say that the crocodiles have kidnapped her. The fishermen believe that these crocodiles are the incarnation of their ancestors, and they are therefore held to be sacred. The children look upon them as close relatives. A girl has disappeared. Her father makes a fine show of lamenting and weeping. But if ever the expression has had a true meaning, these are crocodile tears. Actually, the girl has not been a victim of the crocodiles. Her father has simply sold her to a slave dealer. Where do these girls end up? Sometimes they are bought by men from nearby villages and become part of the material wealth of the new tribes. But more often, they are spirited away to the Arabian Peninsula to become concubines in the harems of the desert princes. 2 cameras are hidden at a safe distance. A microphone is buried out of sight. Above all, we bring money. We don't have to wait long. The dealer shows up with 2 women we have told him we want to buy.
How do you do?
How do you do?
Fine. What is the name of this one?
This is Margaret, and this is Mary. 300 pounds, 300 pounds. Can you see? Fine.
The experiment has succeeded. We set our slaves free, seek a new master, if they are to survive. You don't have to hide yourself in a forest to buy a slave. You can buy one on the outskirts of a large city as well. This is an African city at night. One gigantic flophouse. A huge bed of misery and desperation. We have been told of a house that sells its merchandise to the biggest traders in Eastern Africa. Our informant leads us there through narrow streets and back alleys. Then we watch a girl being bargained for by a rich merchant passing through town. This is indeed a trap, but hardly a tourist trap. We are in the neighborhood of the oasis of Ahila, on the edge of an airfield abandoned after the war. An old plane lands, and simultaneously a truck emerges from the darkness. The plane takes off at dawn. Do the pilots know what cargo they are flying and where these children end up? We find our answer. Great opportunity for the slave traders lies in the pilgrimage to Mecca. Mecca is the heart of Islam, and Islam is the third religion in the world. Show me one single Muslim country where slavery is not practiced, Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia once said to a journalist.
We are sorry to have to drag the United Nations into it again, but there is something we must add. We have the evidence of this British officer, Lieutenant Marlon Steele of the 37th Military Police District of Maridi. On the morning of May the 6th, 1963, 5 Kivu slave traders were arrested. They are guilty of having used these instruments of torture on 15 Bakudo children so as to reduce them to such a pitiful physical condition as to arouse the generosity of the passers-by. We are sorry and ashamed to have to insist on showing this terrible document. This young British officer who is collecting evidence is sorry and ashamed too, but it is his duty. Just as it is our duty and that of the whole civilized world, or the world that calls itself civilized and feels smugly at peace with its conscience and with God, to consider this an accusation, to stop this cruelty.
a poor neighbourhood of Mauritania's capital, Nouakchott. Habi and her son don't have much, but even so, it's a lot more than they used to have when Habi was a slave to an Arab family. 2 years ago, an organisation campaigning against slavery rescued her from her former masters.
In the beginning it was very difficult for me. It was very difficult to leave my masters because I thought there weren't any other options. I just couldn't imagine I'd be able to live without them.
Biram Ould Abaid works for the NGO in question, SOS Slaves. He says it's freed more than 50 slaves over the past 2 years, but that there are thousands more still out there. The slaves are mainly from the ethnic community known as the Haratine, a group oppressed for 800 years in the region, so long that slaves too often simply accept their fate as an inferior caste.
When you talk about slaves in Mauritania, you're talking about people who were born slaves. That means who work with no salary, who have no rights with their children, no right to education, and if it's a woman, she must sleep with her masters at their will.
Messaoud Ould Bouker is ethnically a Haratine. He's a candidate for the presidential election and has risen to be president of the National Assembly, a first for his community. He's frustrated about the lack of progress.
Just because I'm president of the National Assembly doesn't mean that the problems of my community are therefore resolved, or that there's even been any evolution. On the contrary, we're doing everything for the concrete cases of slavery which are on the way. People can't accept the fact that the government is treating these cases as slavery.
Slavery was officially outlawed in Mauritania in 1981, but it only became a crime to own slaves in 2007. Theoretically, the offence holds heavy punishment, but in reality, nobody has so far been sentenced. Habi and her son might have been spared from their lives as slaves, but thousands of others haven't yet been so lucky.
These ruins are all that's now left of the village of Niamlel in southern Sudan. Like many predominantly Christian villages in this area, it's been looted by Sudanese Arab militias from the Muslim north. They carry out regular raids on the Dinka tribespeople. They're supposedly freelance robbers, but the village is on the front line of the war between north and south. The Muslim government appears to turn a blind eye. This family says they've been left with nothing after the Arabs carried off goats and cattle and then burned the village. Up to 300 villagers were killed, mostly men. Then the women and children were rounded up. The Arabs captured Abuk Maru, along with dozens of others. She believes they intended to sell her in the north as a slave, but let her go when they discovered she was blind. They still have her 2 children. Akai Barjok was captured in the same raid along with her 3 children. She was rescued by her husband, who undertook the dangerous journey to the north, where he found his whole family had been sold into slavery. Apin Akot paid around £100 a head for his family's freedom. It took him months to earn the money, but few people managed to make the journey north. So 4 hours walk away from the village, a new market has sprung up. Arab traders have realized that they can sell escaped slaves back to their families for 5 times the price in the north. At this market, former slaves change hands for £500, a few Kalashnikovs, or 5 cows a head. A group of 22 people wait to be sold. To get here, they've escaped from their owners and been rounded up by the Arab traders, who bring them back to the south. Until money changes hands, they won't be free.
600,000.
22.
Was 12.
22.
The practice has disturbed some Arab merchants.
الزول اللي بيخش مسألة زي ده شبه ما فاهم أو ما بيعرف الحياة. إذا كان بيعرف الحياة ما بيخش مشكلة زي ده.
But controversially, a Western aid agency has got involved.
Freedom.
Literally freedom for 20 people.
These children are being brought back with money supplied by Christian Solidarity International. Here, it's handing over £10,000 to a slave trader.
نشتغل نعيش بس ناكل ونشرب.
ولا بتاع برك.
ده لا ده أنا بقول القروش ده ما لي أنا براي.
The charity made a clandestine visit to the area, which is closed to aid workers. Baroness Cox, the British Conservative peer, defended the programme.
You came here and you saw families whose children were enslaved, families who've lost everything. They've lost their livestock, they've lost their means of living, and they have to raise the equivalent of 5 cows to buy their child back. Would you leave those children in slavery if you could actually enable the local people to redeem their own children's freedom?
The practice of taking slaves has flourished during Sudan's civil war. Niamlal village is close to the Sudan People's Liberation Army, fighting government forces in the north. It's alleged that the government is training and even arming the Arab looters to further its military goals.
They are practicing the slavery and they are killing people, innocent people, without any reason. If they want to crush us, they should fight us alone without killing and abducting people and practicing slavery.
In a situation of war, it is likely some mistake may take place. But I can assure you, it is not a policy, and we challenge those evidences we have support to bring it to us, to take them to our appropriate authorities, and we can assure you we can respond to them.
People like Alouat Majok may provide that evidence. She became a slave as a child. Her baby is the result of a rape by her Arab master and bears his name. Sudan has been at war for over 15 years. It's left its mark on almost every aspect of life. International slavery was abolished 100 years ago, but in Sudan no one seems to have noticed its passing.
The first colony the Arabs founded in Africa was in the Dahlak Islands in Eritrea, and the Arabs developed a large slave trade to feed the insatiable demands of the Basra salt and soil reclamation projects around Basra in Iraq, where the delta, where the Tigris and Euphrates enters the Persian Gulf.
This is also Muhammad's time, 7th century.
Yes. This was the rise of the Arab Empire that became, an international empire. But the first 250 years of the Arab Empire saw a large, massive slave trade where they were going into East Africa and taking slaves. If you read the classic Arab scholars like Ibn Khaldun and Al-Masudi and even Ibn Battuta, they speak of these massive concentrations of African slaves in Iraq. They were called the Zanj, as in Zanzibar or in Tanzania. The Arab word for Africans was Zanj, Z-A-N-J. So there was a series of the revolts of the Zanj, or the African slaves in Iraq. And at one point, the revolts were so large that the Zanj rose up and captured the city of Basra and massacred, because apparently they were treated so brutally by their Arab slave masters. They massacred every man, woman, and child in Basra and established an African kingdom in Basra, which is the closest large city to Baghdad, which at the time was the center of Arab culture in the world.
The first great African slave revolt historically documented took place in Iraq. Known as the Zanj Revolt, it lasted from 869 to 883. Thousands of African slaves from East Africa working in the salt marshes in southern Iraq joined forces with other groups to revolt against slavery and for social changes. The Zanj rebels even established their own state with its capital called Al-Muqtada, and during 14 years seriously threatened and challenged the reign of the Abbasid Caliphate.
They spoke of, Al-Masudi in particular spoke of one plantation in the salt fields of Basra that had 50,000 African slaves there. Now, if 50,000 African slaves were living there, to get those 50,000 African slaves, they had to capture 100,000 able-bodied adults in East Africa. Because out of every 2 slaves that are captured, 1 would die in transport. So, if in Americas, if a slave life lasted 7 years, let's just say for round figures, the Africans in the slave fields of Basra lived for 10 years. That means every 10 years, 200,000 new able-bodied adults had to be captured in Africa to supply 100,000 slaves to keep the Basra plantations operating. So that means in 100 years, you're talking about 2 million African able-bodied adults were taken from East Africa to Iraq, okay? And they're treated so brutally that they regularly rose up in rebellion. Not so much in the European slave trade in Africa, but in the case of the Zanj, the African slaves in Iraq, there was subhuman bondage. And that if you read the Arab writers, the description of the African slaves, where they spoke of them having large sexual organs, of smelling bad, of being thieves, of wanting to rape their women, of being dishonest and lazy.
Which I did in the University of Birmingham, UK. And I wrote the book because there was very little writing on some of the themes that I wanted to address, that I addressed in the book, having to do with the theme of Islam's interaction with African traditional religions, the whole history of jihad in West Africa, and as part of that, a very important part of that, the slave raiding and the slave trade that happened within West Africa by Muslim communities. That was why I wrote the book, because not many had written on these kind of themes in Islam history in West Africa.
Now, I'd like to look at one of the topics in your book, the topic of colonization. We know that the Christian West colonized Africa. The West has acknowledged this and is self-critical in this regard. Did the Islamic empires colonize Africa?
Well, yes, there was a lot of activities on the part of Muslims in Africa, especially in West Africa. What happened there was not necessarily outside colonization, but there was a form of colonization in the sense that the dominant Islamic tribes conquered weaker tribes and imposed Islamic rule over them. And therefore, there was some kind of internal colonization going on. The Fulani in West Africa in particular were very much in the habit of conquering and imposing Islamic rule on other tribes. So that was a form of internal colonization, yes.
What about with the Arab conquest of North Africa? Was that a form of colonization?
Absolutely. That the Arab conquest of North Africa was a form of colonization that took place in the 7th century when Arab Muslims burst out of Saudi Arabia and conquered Egypt and went on to conquer the whole of North Africa. There were a lot of Berber tribes there. The Egyptian Copts were the original indigenes of the land, as well as the Berbers. And they were all conquered and Islamized and Arabized. That was also a form of colonization, definitely.
Now, do Muslims today acknowledge this? Are they self-critical about this?
Not to the extent that the West has become very critical. In fact, many Muslims don't even admit that there was any form of colonization. Even though if you talk to the Berbers, and let's be also aware that many of the Berbers will become Muslim, the Berbers will tell you they have been colonized. There's been Arab imperialism. The same thing in Egypt. The Copts know that they are the original, the indigenes of the place. They feel like they have been colonized. The same thing will happen we talk to Sudanese. They will tell you that Sudan was colonized by Arab Muslim invaders. So yes, they will not admit it, but there is that kind of history there.
Okay, thanks for that. I want to move on to the topic of slavery now. Did the Muslim empires practice slavery?
Absolutely. But slavery was a very important part of Islamic expansion in West Africa, and in fact in the Sudan, and from the very earliest period of Islamic penetration into Africa. It started by buying, purchasing slaves and trading in slaves, and then it went on from purchasing to raiding for slaves and capturing slaves deliberately, especially mainly black Africans, and transporting them into North Africa and into Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, and onwards to the Ottoman Empire to Turkey. So slavery was a very endemic part of Islamic interaction with Africa. And in West Africa, the jihad's period of the 18th and 19th century involved massive slave raiding and slave trading. And many of the slaves that were captured and sent and sold and taken into the transatlantic slave trade, most of those who were doing the raiding at the time were Muslim communities. Because they were the dominant tribes. So a lot of that happened. That is not to say that non-Muslim communities were involved in raiding, but the dominant tribes were the Muslim communities that were doing the raiding at the time.
The treatment of slaves is a topic that you bring up in your book. Can you talk about some of the differences in the way that slaves were treated in the Western world compared to in the Islamic world?
Yeah, one of the themes I explored in my book is this perception that Muslims treated their slaves much more humanely than the Western slave trade. And what I found out in my own research was that that is not necessarily the case, and that there were very harsh treatments of slaves by Muslim groups. It was just a done deal at the time. And one of the key differences I looked at in my book that whereas slaves taken to the West were able to marry and reproduce and have their families, and you can still find large populations of African Americans today in North America and in the Caribbean, you go to the Islamic world and you find very few black remnants of the slave trade, which was very massive. And one of the reasons is that many of the male black slaves taken into the Islamic world were castrated as eunuchs, which meant that they could not, of course, reproduce. And the other factor is that many of the women were taken as concubines by their slave masters, and they gave birth to mixed races, and they were very much absorbed into the society. So you don't have black slave and kind of descendants in the Muslim world as you would in North America, and part of the reason is the castration and the way the slaves were treated.
Did the Islamic world abolish slavery?
Slavery persisted in Islamic countries far, far longer than it did in the West. The West abolished slavery long before the Islamic countries ever abolished slavery. And they did so under a lot of pressure from colonial governments and from Western governments and from all kinds of activist groups. And in fact, the Saudi Arabia, for instance, abolished slavery in 1961 or 1960 thereabout, whereas Mauritania abolished slavery in 1981. And these were done on paper, and a lot of it is still being done. In practice, there are still a lot of slaves in Muslim countries. And the Sudan, during the Civil War, there was a lot of slave raiding going on, done by the Arab Muslims in the north against the enemies and the Christian Africans in the south. So even up to the 90s and this century, there was still capturing of young African men, boys in the Sudan for sale. So slavery continues, even though it has been abolished on paper in many Muslim countries.
I often hear Muslims talking about the golden age of Islam, and they look back to this as the time when Islam ruled, and this is the golden period that they look back to. What's your understanding of the golden period, the golden age of Islam?
Yeah, it depends on which Muslims group we are talking about, but the golden age of Islam, many Muslims look back to the period between the 7th and the 9th century, when during the Abbasid Caliphate, or rather from the 9th century to around the 13th century, during the Abbasid Caliphate. They talk about it as the golden period of Islam. But if you look at that history, it is fraught with difficulties, with a lot of problems. Yes, a lot of progress was made under that period. There were times of very stable rulership. There were times of progress in terms of learning and science and exploration. There was a lot of that going on. But that does not necessarily, and that was the time that Islamic orthodoxy was formalized. So there were a lot of milestones within that period. But in terms of golden period, I think it's very tricky to begin to talk about golden periods. If we look back and look at how messy the whole situation was at that period, and many other periods in Islamic history, just like many of the other empires.
Yeah, because from what you were saying, it was a time of conquests, colonization, and slavery as well.
Absolutely.
With everything else.
Absolutely.
So there may have been those great moments, but there's still conquest, colonization, and slavery as part of it.
Absolutely. And during that time, it has to be said, Muslims were not the only ones who were conquering, other people were conquering also. And slavery, yes, during the 9th up to the 13th century, slavery was still very much an Islamic phenomenon as compared to the West. Of course, there was ancient slavery in many other societies, but in terms of chattel slavery, in terms of slavery as an institution, that was profitable. That was very much still an Arab Islamic preserve until the West came in sometime from the 15th, 16th century onwards. So yes, there was a lot of that as part of that so-called golden period of Islam.
Now, discussing these ideas in our universities is not always an easy thing to do. In your book, you write, hence, in the study of Islam in the West, the dominant convention is that a critical approach is reserved for the Christian past, but forbidden for the Muslim past. The net result is a romantic picture of the history of Islam, avoiding and sometimes denying such issues as the jihadist slaughter and mass enslavement of traditional African believers. Can you just talk to us a bit about your experience as an African in the Western universities talking about these issues?
Yeah, that is actually a very important question. I, as an African who embarked on the study of Islam in Africa, was very frustrated that, especially back in the 90s when I was doing my studies, that Western academics were shying away, almost self-censoring on these difficult themes of jihad, of the violence associated with jihad, and the slave raiding and slave trade that was very massively undertaken by Muslim societies in Africa. And some only noted in a footnote, and we don't want to discuss it. And that was very frustrating. Meanwhile, they will go at length and talk freely and openly about the Western transatlantic dimension of slave trade. And so for me, this painting of a very romantic picture of the Islamic past in Africa was hindering interfaith dialogue and dialogue between Muslims and Christians in particular. And especially in a situation where the radical Muslim groups were laying claim to these histories, these romanticized histories that was written mainly by Western scholars, that they had a golden age of Islam in Africa that they want to return to. Unfortunately, many of the groups that we have today that are ideological Muslim radical groups, and even Boko Haram in Nigeria, are laying claim to some of these romanticized histories that has been contributed to by Western scholarship and academia on the west of Islam in Africa. And this is what I was trying to challenge and to raise questions about, that we have to paint a more realistic history of the past. Africans have to get a more holistic history of their past if we have to live together, have meaningful dialogue between ourselves as Muslims and Christians.
So what do you think is the way forward?
Yeah, I explored in my book, the reason why I wrote this book was not to be polemical against Islam or anything of that sort. It was simply to say to African Muslims, my co-Africans, fellow Africans, that look, both on the Islamic and Christian fronts and the past, we have difficult histories with the way these traditions interact with Africa. So we need to take both histories critically. We need to study the histories critically, instead of denying and romanticizing one history. Because when we do that, we are not going to, unless we understand our past very clearly and honestly, we cannot move forward with any sense of integrity and mutual respect. So the whole idea is, how do we move forward? Let's have a much more critical discourse of our past, and then we can move forward with meaningful futures together. That's the only way to move forward in this.
Thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Akai tinga mai ke ga ja pingi te len tembe wong pin ka jal kai karu ke monjeng ke ga ja yo ko chena ku mai ja pingi ku mai ja chin ben wer ni ya miskin fa ku nien dele ku beki ana ki tu pat dan chin no ka chin tang ni je to ku wong chin nyai a wor wel pat wong chi de no ne na chi kwa de ten qua the chin a chen nam ya a chi nyai.
Sudan. Since 1952, this enormous African country has been struck by a civil war between the north and the south. One of the horrible consequences of this war is the revival of slavery.
Mình kakak, aci lebih awak. Kalau awak ni, mungkin ada kau. Kau yang lu awak baik, kau jalan new sini kakak arwah aci lebih, aci tewi. Kakak benar awak ketuk kan? Aci jaloi kan kau pas kau jalan ni teng, kalau kau kau yang ni tim Quran. Jalo ala datin, kau cinta benar awak. Goi dom ikan lah, dom kau, itu dom siapa yang kau. Yo kan baik, yo kan nok, yo kalau keluar buat,
So there were, what, 414 slaves, so it's 20,700,000 Sudanese pounds that we owe you. Or put it in his, okay, that's 5 million. That's 5. That's 6 million. 13 million. You know, we are here and you have come back because there are many people around the world who've heard about the suffering of the slaves in Sudan. I can only name a few, but I think of Bishop Caesar Matsalari and Bishop Makram Ghazis. And so many people have not only felt bad in their hearts about the suffering, but they have felt that they must do something, and they've prayed every day, and they have given money. So now you're free to go back to your villages, to find your mothers and fathers and your husbands and your relatives and neighbors, and we wish God's blessing upon you and hope that you can live in peace and security from this day onward.
The American John Eibner, who represents CSI, the Swiss organization Christian Solidarity International, travels about 6 times a year to South Sudan. During his visits, he buys back the freedom of women and children that have been enslaved.
This is the wife of his brother, and this is his daughter.
Ah, his daughter. And were they taken at the same time?
The same day.
The same day. When were they taken?
And then, last year.
At Warawa?
No, last year. It's not negative, but negative. What?
And so, have you seen them since they have been back, or is right now the first time you've seen them?
That
was the first time. Very good. Well, we're very happy. No one knows exactly how many slaves there are in Sudan, but we have reasonably good estimates of the numbers, and we reckon that there are over 100,000 chattel slaves in Sudan. That is, slaves that are the private properties of private masters. And there are many more people who are subjected to slave-like conditions who have not been kept by private masters but end up in government-run concentration camps, which the government calls peace camps. Okay, Noor. Okay, shukran.
Slave trading is a thriving business. Northern militias are raiding villages in the south for slaves, which they then take back to the north. They keep them in their households or sell them to other masters. A few Arabs in the north, so-called retrievers, are tracing the slaves and buying them. They then bring them back to the south, where these retrievers present the slaves to John Eibner, who is buying their freedom.